Unlock the secrets. This is the African Arcana.
Subscribe to reveal more mysteries within the African Arcana.
What if Africa became one country tomorrow? Think about that for a second. No borders. One leader, one flag, one currency in every wallet from Cairo to Cape Town. It sounds like the plot of a political sci-fi movie. Wild, impossible, maybe even dangerous. But that's exactly what Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré, just called for. In a moment that stunned the continent and shocked the world, Traoré stood before a sea of soldiers, looked straight into the cameras, and declared what no African leader has dared to say with this much force in decades. Africa must unite. Now. Not someday. Now. He didn't stop at ideas. He laid out a bold plan. One African government. A single currency called Afro Money. And one African passport that would erase every colonial border overnight. For a continent fractured by colonial lines, economic dependence, and political mistrust, that statement hit like a lightning strike. And the aftershocks were instant. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #United States of Africa and Afro Money surged from Lagos to Nairobi. Some called it revolutionary. Others called it reckless. But no one could ignore it. That's the twist. This wasn't just another Pan-African dream speech. It was a direct challenge to how power works, not just in Africa, but around the globe. And it's coming from a leader who's already expelled French troops, ditched the IMF, and formed a new military alliance with Mali and Guinea. He's not asking for permission. The question is, can one man's vision shatter centuries of division? Or will this dream collapse under the same forces that have kept Africa divided for so long? Let's find out. If you've ever wondered what Africa could look like without borders, or whether that's even a good idea, keep watching. You might be surprised by what's already in motion. This isn't the first time someone dreamed of a united Africa. In fact, that dream is older than most of us. Decades ago, Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, famously warned, "Political independence without economic unity is meaningless." He called for a single African state back in 1963. But here's the difference. Most leaders delivered poetry. Traoré delivered a plan. While others romanticized Pan-Africanism, he stood on stage and gave it deadlines. One government, one African currency, one passport. And according to his inner circle, they're already drafting the logistics. This isn't a vision for 2063. This is now. That's the new twist. The timeline has shifted from someday to immediately. His supporters say that's what makes him dangerous to the old world order and irresistible to the new generation. Because for once, someone isn't just talking about African unity in vague metaphors. He's building it into policy. Let's break down his vision. First, a single African government. Not a diplomatic club like the African Union, but a real political structure with power. One voice, one defense strategy, one foreign policy. Second, Afro Money. A shared currency that breaks free from the CFA franc, the euro, and the dollar. No more exchange rate traps. No more begging the IMF. Trade between African countries in African currency. Third, a single passport for all Africans. No more visas to visit your neighbors. Freedom of movement from Algeria to Angola, from Senegal to Somalia. It's bold. It's idealistic. And maybe, just maybe, it's what this generation has been waiting for. But let's not get carried away. Because behind every dream this big lies a wall that's even bigger. And the cracks are already showing. Some African presidents have quietly admitted they were blindsided. No meetings, no consultation. Just a speech that essentially proposed tearing down the entire map. Others are wondering, who gets to lead this united Africa? Which government will surrender its power first? What happens to national armies, parliaments, constitutions? And if we can't even agree on a trade deal without 3 years of negotiation, how are we going to agree on one flag? But before we dive into the chaos, ask yourself this. If someone offered your country a chance to erase every colonial border and rewrite the rules of power, would you say yes? Or would you cling to what's familiar, even if it's broken? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because what you think actually matters. Unity sounds beautiful, until you realize what it demands. On paper, a united Africa is a poetic masterpiece. In practice, it's a battlefield of contradictions. And if we're being honest, the road from one dream to one reality is paved with political landmines. Let's talk about the first one, sovereignty. For this vision to work, every African leader would need to surrender something they value more than money, more than land. Control. Real control. Of borders, budgets, armies, and laws. Can you imagine that happening? Can you picture 54 presidents, many of whom fought tooth and nail just to stay in power, willingly signing away their national authority to a central African body? This isn't just political theory. It's political suicide for some of them. Now let's dig deeper. Traoré talks about one government. But which system are we talking about? Africa isn't a political monolith. Some countries are fragile democracies, others are monarchies. A few are under military regimes, including his own. So, what model wins? Western-style democracy? A new hybrid? Or will we end up with a centralized system that favors the strongest and silences the rest? That brings us to the next obstacle. Trust. How do you build a union across countries that don't even trust each other? Borders weren't just drawn by colonizers. They've been hardened by history, rivalry, even war. Will Ethiopia and Eritrea suddenly forget decades of conflict? Will North African Arab states align comfortably with sub-Saharan nations? Will countries like South Africa, who already punch above their weight, agree to share influence with smaller, unstable neighbors? That's where the economics get even messier. The African economy is a world of extremes. Nigeria's GDP towers over countries like Malawi or Chad. Oil-rich Angola isn't going to rush to pool budgets with debt-ridden Sudan. And can we blame them? Let's be honest. Economic unity means redistribution. It means the rich help the poor. That's what the European Union tried with Greece and Spain. And they barely survived the fallout. The irony is, African countries trade more with Europe and China than they do with each other. You want to build a superstate? Start by fixing that. Now, security. How do you open borders when some regions are plagued by civil war, terrorism, and coups? Can you really afford free movement when weapons and fighters can travel as easily as students and entrepreneurs? Let's not pretend Africa is a blank canvas. It's a continent carrying the weight of centuries. Colonization, corruption, foreign manipulation, and internal division. That's not something a good speech can erase. And yet, something about this moment still feels different. Maybe it's because for the first time in years, someone is not just naming the problems. They're attacking the foundation that created them. The very borders that were never drawn for Africans in the first place. What would it take for you to give up a piece of your national identity for something bigger, something continental? Would you do it, if it meant a shot at dignity, power, and unity? Leave your thoughts. I'm not here to tell you the answer, just to ask the question. Money isn't just paper, it's power. And in Africa, it's a leash. For decades, many African countries haven't really controlled their own currencies. Take the CFA franc, still used by 14 nations, pegged to the euro, backed by the French treasury. Sounds convenient? Not when France holds your reserves and dictates your monetary policy. That's not a partnership. That's financial dependency dressed up in a suit. Traoré wants to change that. His idea? Afro Money, a single African currency, built by Africans, for Africans. It's not just about simplifying trade, it's about breaking free from foreign control, cutting the cord, reclaiming sovereignty, not just politically, but economically. Because let's face it, how sovereign are you really if you need permission to print your own money? Now, supporters say this is the revolution Africa's been waiting for. Today, only around 17% of African trade happens within the continent. That's shockingly low. Why? Currency instability, border friction, costly conversions. It's easier for many African countries to trade with Europe or China than with their neighbors. Afro Money could change that, creating a massive internal market, reducing transaction costs, and unlocking Africa's own consumer power. Sounds great. But here's the catch. Creating a single currency is a nightmare. Ask the European Union. The euro almost broke apart during the debt crisis. And that was with countries that had relatively stable governments, similar economies, and decades of preparation. Africa? It's a whole different terrain. Let's be blunt. Can you build a shared currency between Nigeria, with its oil economy and massive population, and Zimbabwe, where inflation once reached 89.7 sextillion%? Can you synchronize fiscal policies between 54 countries with wildly different budgets, debt levels, and political systems? You'd need a powerful central bank. Who controls it? Unified banking standards. Who enforces them? Agreement on inflation targets, interest rates, capital controls. How realistic is that? The real problem with money isn't economic. It's psychological. People don't trust what they didn't grow up with. You can't just print Afro money and expect everyone to believe in it overnight. But here's the paradox. The deeper Africa stays tied to foreign currencies, the harder it becomes to shape its own destiny. Traoré isn't pitching Afro money as a quick fix. He's pitching it as economic liberation. A declaration that Africa won't keep dancing to tunes composed in Paris, Washington, or Brussels, and maybe, just maybe, that's the point. If your country launched a new currency tomorrow, would you trust it with your savings? Or would you convert everything to dollars just in case? That's the question Afro Money has to answer. Not on paper, but in people's hearts. Share your take. I'd love to hear the real talk. Imagine this. You're born in Ghana. You study in Kenya. You work in Morocco. You vacation in Namibia. And you never once need a visa. That's the promise of one African passport, the third pillar in Traoré's unification plan. It's not just about travel. It's about tearing down the invisible walls left behind by colonial rule. Right now, it's often easier for an African citizen to visit Europe than a neighboring African country. That's not just inconvenient. That's a design flaw. A leftover from an era where movement within Africa was restricted on purpose, to divide, to control, to isolate. Traoré wants to flip that script. A single African passport would give every citizen the right to live, work, and move freely across 54 nations. It would treat the entire continent as a shared homeland, not a patchwork of fences. Sounds liberating, doesn't it? But here comes the reality check. How do you manage security in a system like that? What happens when you open borders between countries facing insurgencies, trafficking, or political instability? How do you stop militants or criminal networks from slipping across lines without detection? And then there's the economic fear. Will wealthier nations become magnets for migration? Will fragile economies be drained of their skilled workers? Mini twist. This isn't just theoretical. The European Union tried this with the Schengen zone. It worked, until a refugee crisis hit. Then the walls went back up fast. And Europe has stronger institutions than many African states. Coordinated databases, border sharing systems, joint policing. Can Africa build that level of integration from scratch? Still, for millions, the emotional weight of this passport is undeniable. It's not just a document, it's a statement. I belong here, anywhere, everywhere. All of this is home. That matters, especially to young people who've grown up feeling like strangers on their own continent. Students tired of waiting months and paying hundreds just to study in Uganda. Entrepreneurs are blocked from expanding across borders by endless paperwork. Families divided by artificial lines on a map. The one passport idea speaks directly to them. But the deeper question isn't about logistics, it's about identity. Can Africans truly begin to see themselves as one people, not just Ghanaians or Rwandans or Algerians, but as Africans first? That's not a policy issue. That's a mindset revolution. Would you feel comfortable if your country erased all visa requirements tomorrow? Would it feel like freedom or chaos waiting to happen? Let me know what side of the border your mind is on. Power doesn't just disappear. When one region rises, another feels the pressure. And a truly united Africa? That would shake the global order to its core. Let's not pretend the world's major powers are cheering Traoré on. His vision doesn't just challenge African norms, it threatens global leverage. Why? Because a divided Africa is easier to manage, easier to bargain with, easier to exploit. For decades, Western governments and institutions have maintained influence through loans, military bases, development partnerships, and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. A fractured continent meant 54 individual deals, 54 negotiation tables, 54 weak spots to push through. But imagine trying to negotiate with one Africa, one currency, one central bank, one foreign policy. That's not a continent. That's a superpower in the making. And that scares people. Let's talk economics. The world doesn't just depend on African raw materials. It depends on Africa staying cheap. Cheap labor, cheap land, cheap exports. A unified market with internal trading power and Afro Money at the center would disrupt that model. Now shift to military affairs. A continent with a coordinated defense structure, less dependent on U.S. bases, French troops, or Chinese-built infrastructure. That changes the entire game in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, across the Red Sea. Some experts already believe that Traoré's rejection of the IMF and expulsion of foreign forces wasn't just ideology. It was a warning shot, a signal that new alliances are forming, and the old ones becoming irrelevant. Now zoom in on China. Beijing has invested billions in Africa, roads, railways, ports, loans, but its strategy depends on bilateral deals, not dealing with a unified bloc that might push back. Same with the US. Same with the EU. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's geopolitics. A stronger Africa means less leverage for everyone else. So what happens now? Pressure. Diplomatic friction. Possibly even sabotage. Not always direct, but subtle. Economic influence. Media narratives. Discrediting campaigns. We've seen it before when African leaders stepped too far out of line. Let's not forget what happened to Patrice Lumumba or Thomas Sankara. Leaders who dared to think independently and didn't get to grow old. That's the risk Traoré is facing. But he's betting it's worth it. Here's the uncomfortable question. Does the world want a strong, united Africa or just a cooperative one? If you were in Traoré's shoes, would you keep pushing forward? Tell me, what would you risk for the right to choose your own future? The halls of power are quiet, but the streets, they're erupting. Because while diplomats scramble to decode Traoré's playbook, the people, especially the youth, already know what it means. For them, this isn't just a political idea, it's personal. Across TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, millions of Africans are reposting Traoré's speech, adding captions like, "This is the Africa we were promised. Let's tear down the fences they left behind." For decades, African identity has been fractured. You're Nigerian, not African. You're Kenyan, not African. Your passport defines your limits. Your currency ties you to foreign banks. Your borders tell you where you don't belong, even when it's just 100 miles away. But now, someone's finally saying, you belong everywhere here. To a generation raised under the shadow of colonial borders, this hits different. It's a rebellion, not against foreign powers, but against inherited limits. And the emotional pull isn't just within Africa. Across the diaspora, in London, Paris, Atlanta, Rio, Black communities are watching. They see Traoré's vision as not just African, but global. A call to reclaim a narrative that's been defined for them for centuries. Meanwhile, inside the continent, there's a surge of Pan-African optimism unlike anything in recent memory. Students imagine cross-border universities. Entrepreneurs visualize selling products continent-wide without permits. Mothers dream of sending their kids across Africa without needing a visa or conversion fees. Farmers talk about selling grain without it dying at a border checkpoint. For the first time in a long time, people are thinking continentally. But hope has a shadow. And that shadow is fear. Because for every person who sees possibility, another sees potential collapse. What if unity means instability? What if Afro Money crashes economies overnight? What if free movement floods job markets, raises crime, or worsens inequality? This isn't ignorance, it's caution. Many Africans have seen promises before: structural reforms, regional partnerships, AU charters, ECOWAS deals. And yet, they still wait in line for visas, still pay in euros, still get treated like outsiders on their own land. So they ask, is this real, or just another headline? And that's fair. Because for unity to move from hope to history, it has to survive skepticism. It has to prove it's more than a trending speech. If you're watching this and you're African, or part of the African diaspora, I want to know, do you feel more united today than you did 10 years ago? Or has it all been talk, recycled again and again? Drop your experience, your truth. Because policy might shape borders, but people shape nations. Every great dream has a graveyard full of failed attempts. And Africa's path to unity? It's already littered with broken promises and half-built alliances. Let's not sugarcoat this. There are serious structural reasons why this vision, as bold and necessary as it is, might never become reality. The first, political will. On paper, African leaders love the idea of unity. They say the right words at summits. They pose for photos with Pan-African flags. But when it comes to surrendering real power, silence. Because let's be honest, uniting under one government means presidents, prime ministers, and parliaments would have to give up control. National budgets would be subject to continental approval. Foreign policies would no longer be independent. Armies might be merged or dissolved. For many sitting leaders, that's not a step forward. It's a demotion, and no one climbs to the top just to give the throne away. Then comes the second obstacle: economic disparity. Africa is not economically equal. Nigeria's GDP is over $400 billion. Meanwhile, Burundi's is barely $3 billion. Some countries are swimming in oil revenues. Others are drowning in debt. So who pays what? Will a prosperous country like Botswana fund infrastructure in Central African Republic? Will South Africa sacrifice domestic spending to stabilize weaker economies? It sounds noble, until it hits taxpayers, and unity begins to look like charity. Third problem, security and stability. Some regions are actively at war. Others are held together by fragile ceasefires or authoritarian regimes. How do you create open borders when violence is still simmering at the edges? Traoré himself knows this. The Sahel, his backyard, is home to militant groups, arms trafficking, and political unrest. Without stability, open movement could become a high-speed highway for chaos. That's not unity. That's an invitation to collapse. And then there's the quiet obstacle: external interference. A united Africa would threaten too many business models. Resource extraction, foreign lending, arms deals, offshore trade routes, they all rely on a fragmented continent. You think no one's paying attention? Think again. History is filled with examples of African leaders who pushed too far and paid the price, not through tanks, but through corruption scandals leaked at the perfect time, financial freezes, media smear campaigns, sudden uprisings no one can trace. Ask yourself, is the world really ready for a strong, self-directed Africa? Finally, and maybe most tragically, there's the obstacle of public fatigue. The average citizen has heard it all before: AU treaties, development blueprints, Agenda 2063. But daily life doesn't change. They still pay bribes to cross borders, still need euros to do business, still face visa rejections from neighboring nations. So when someone like Traoré stands up and says, "This time is different," many respond with a shrug. Not because they don't believe in unity, but because they've been burned by the illusion of it. Here's the tough question. Is African unity being held back by outsiders or by ourselves? And what will it take to overcome not just politics, but generations of distrust? Let's talk about it. Because naming the problem is the first step to doing something real. Let's shift gears for a second. What if the impossible actually happened? What if, 10 years from now, the world wakes up to a headline, "Africa unites under one flag"? What would that world look like? Would Afro money become one of the most traded currencies on the planet? Would African students flow freely across borders like Europeans do today? Would global investors line up not to exploit Africa, but to negotiate with it? Would the rest of the world finally have to treat Africa not as a source, but as a force? Now that sounds like a fantasy, and maybe it is. But so was the United States. 13 rebellious colonies held together by string and shared frustration. So was the European Union, a continent torn apart by war, now held together by shared trade and a common passport. History is full of ideas that sounded ridiculous, until they didn't. Even slavery was once seen as permanent. So was colonialism. So was apartheid. Until one day, it wasn't. So ask yourself, what makes unity any more impossible than those? Because if Africa truly united, economically, politically, psychologically, it wouldn't just change the continent, it would change the world. So here's my question to you. Is it crazy to dream this big, or is it crazier not to? If this vision moved something in you, or challenged what you thought was possible, say it. Let the world hear that voice. It matters more than you think. Can Africa really unite? That's the question we started with. And maybe, after everything we've explored, the politics, the economics, the hope, the fear, the better question is this: can Africa afford to stay divided? Because the cost of fragmentation is no longer abstract. It's visible, it's generational, and it's unsustainable. Every day, division keeps opportunity locked behind borders. It drains potential. It weakens bargaining power. It fuels dependency. Not because Africans lack talent, but because the system still works in pieces. Traoré's vision may be radical. It may be flawed. But at least it dares to reimagine the map. At least it puts the continent back at the center of its own future, instead of waiting for someone else to draw the next line. And that's where you come in. Because unity, like every revolution, doesn't start in conference rooms. It starts in minds, in conversations, in moments like this. You don't have to agree with everything. You don't have to trust every leader. But if something in you believes Africa deserves more, louder, stronger, freer, then say it. Let the debate grow. Let the vision evolve. Let the future begin. If this conversation moved you, share it. If it made you question something, talk about it. If it lit even a small fire, protect it. Because a future worth fighting for always starts with a voice brave enough to imagine it,